As we continue with our discussion of what happened in these letters, Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians, we discover that there's this new teaching that is starting to crop up. And it's made up, as we mentioned in the previous session, by something called Zoroastrianism, by Hellenism, and by Judaism. Now, Zoroastrianism was named after a Persian man by the name of Zoroaster. Persia is what we now think of as Iran. So several hundred years before the first century, when Paul wrote, this man named Zoroaster began to create a new religious philosophy. And it was very complicated, but there are three particularly important points that showed up in the province of Asia during Paul's time. First, Zoroastrianism taught that there was a good God and an evil God. And the good God and the evil God were at war with each other. And the good God, Zoroaster taught, created the world as a place for this battle between good and evil. And then, in order to fight this battle between the good and evil God appropriately on this world created for the battle, the good God and the evil God created intermediary beings. They created what we would think of as angels and demons. So the gods were not directly fighting each other in Zoroaster's religion, but they created a world, and then they created other beings that would do the fighting for them. So by the time we get to Paul's letters to Philemon, Colossians, and the Ephesians, this teaching is starting to show up in their area. And it's starting to get confusing for these new Christians. There's a good God versus an evil God. There's a created world for this war to take place, and there's angels and demons that are going to do the fighting. And that was the influence of Zoroastrianism. Well, while that was happening, Greek philosophy, called Hellenism, was also starting to take root within the church and within church teachings, and it was getting confusing. Two things specifically that the Greeks taught that played into this. First, they taught what was called dualism. We've talked about this briefly before in some of Paul's other journeys. But the Greeks taught that there was a strong distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world. Specifically with people, they taught that we are spiritual beings trapped in a physical body. And they taught because that is true, because we're really just spirit beings in this prison of flesh, the most important thing we can do is to gain knowledge, specifically to gain knowledge about the spiritual reality and about who we are as spiritual beings. Now, the Greek word for knowledge is gnosis. Out of that Greek word gnosis, later, this had not happened yet when Paul wrote these letters, later came a religion known as Gnosticism, because they focused on this strange knowledge about spiritual realities. So Zoroastrianism brought a few key things that were now starting to be talked about in the Roman Empire, especially in this area of Asia. Then Hellenism, Greek philosophy, brought these other pieces, the dualism, matter, physical matter versus spirit, and the importance of knowledge. And then the third piece that came into this for Romans and for the church in Ephesus was Jewish religion. Remember that Jews had dispersed throughout the Roman Empire, and much of what Jews taught, including a lot of their scriptures, was common knowledge. Specifically, in this case, the Jews had scripture. It was their scripture, the law and the prophets. We know it as the Old Testament, but it was already written, it was already available, it was already dispersed throughout the synagogues and throughout the Roman world because of the Jewish religion. In that scripture, there was all of the things that God taught the Jews about God created the heavens and the earth, about there is Satan, there is an evil entity that is supernatural. And the wisdom literature, Psalms, Proverbs, those teach about the importance of wisdom and knowledge. All of that then started to add to what later became Gnosticism. So as it's starting to become a false teaching, as Paul is writing, especially Colossians and Ephesians, all of these things are starting to combine, and they're confusing the Christians along with a lot of other people. What was becoming a new religion said that there is a God. Zoroastrianism teaches that there's a good God and an evil God. Jewish scripture teaches that there's a good God and an evil being. So this new religion said there is a God. But this God who created the world is separate. He is so far above his creation that he can't interact with the world that he's created. So he created angels. And the purpose of the angels is to connect this God who created the planets with his creation. So there's God in this new religion who had to create angels in order to interact with the world that he also created. And in this new forming religion, the most important thing to be aware of, they said, is knowledge, especially spiritual knowledge. Because the real evil in the world is lack of knowledge. So there's a good God in this new religion who created the world but cannot interact with the world. So he created angels, and the real evil is not a separate entity. The real evil in the world is the lack of knowledge. So if you want to overcome evil in your life, you need to gain spiritual knowledge, is what they taught. And the best way to gain spiritual knowledge is from the angels that God created to be the go-between between God and his created people. So what was starting to happen in the church is that people were starting to rely on false or real. They were starting to rely on encounters with spirit beings. And they were saying, I had an encounter with an angel, and the angel taught me things. But then they would keep what was taught a secret. Because part of the religion that was becoming a reality was the fact that I am learning things, and in order for you to gain knowledge, you have to learn knowledge yourself. We can't share knowledge. I am more spiritually mature than you are. If you want to be as spiritually mature as I am, you need to have an encounter with an angel too. So there was this very strange mix of Zoroaster's teaching, Greek philosophy, and Jewish scriptures that was now confusing people, and it was about ready to become its own religion. One other piece that got added was what was called asceticism. Asceticism is a word that means to deny yourself, specifically to deny your physical needs. Remember, Greeks taught that there was a strong distinction between the physical and the spiritual. Our bodies are not important. They're merely prisons for our true spirit selves. Therefore, this new religion taught, you need to deny all of the things that would normally bring you physical pleasure. And now, as you do that, you will gain even more knowledge of the spiritual reality around you. Just follow all of these self-denying rules and laws. That was the religion that later became known as Gnosticism, When Paul's writing the letter, it was just new. It wasn't coherent. There weren't pastors. There weren't churches for this. But it was starting to become a reality for the Ephesians and the Colossians and the people who were living in that part of the Roman Empire. So as we pick it up in our next session, we'll talk about what Paul said we should do in the face of this false teaching.